Yeah, I turned this on. I don't know if it's okay. Because they asked if I wanted to stand in front of the lectern. I'm a roamer. Occasionally my wife tells me to stand still because I move from one side of the stage to the other. I found at this point in my career, it's much more difficult to hit a moving target than a stationary. Again, first and foremost, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting. It's something that I found in doing my work across the globe, that many local populations have been removed from their land, and in some circumstances people don't really know who the traditional owners were. So I found it much better to acknowledge those traditional owners either by name or just by in a very broad sense. My name is Joe Watkins. I am a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. My father's family are the Watkins and Willis families from southeast of Oklahoma. On my mother's side, my family are the Hills and the Flowers. Surprisingly enough, the Hills and the Flowers family are not Indian. You know, people think we come from nature, so when I talk about being from the Hills and the Flowers, they think, oh, that's very much the native side, but they were French, Irish, basically, as my mother said, American Mongol. On my father's side, we are full-blood Choctaw. My family has been involved in many different things over the course of our existence in Oklahoma, and I'm very proud to consider Oklahoma my home. Currently, I live in Tacoma Park in the Washington, D.C. area. It's an area that's very nice. I like our neighbors. I think that there are quite a large number of Salvadorian families, a large number of African families. It's a very diverse population. We hear a great deal of many different spoken languages. And in American culture, with the rapid disappearance of our native languages, it really makes me appreciate hearing all the other languages still very much in use. I have been involved in archaeology for more than 45 years now. I actually got started in archaeology when I was 10 years old. I was walking on the family homestead in southeast Oklahoma and found a projecting point anywhere from 2,000 to 6,000 years old. At that time, I really wanted to be a paleontologist. I wanted to go to Gobi Desert and dig up dinosaur eggs like Rorschach Andrews at the time. So I wanted to do those sorts of things. But my grandmother made it known that the projecting point that I had found was not from the Choctaw people. She let it be known that it was part of the unwritten history of the people who had lived in that area before the Choctaws were removed there in the 1830s and 1840s. And she made it known to me that it was very important that that unwritten history not get lost. Okay? So at 10 years old, I found a very nice arrowhead. But it really wasn't until about 7 or 8 years later that I recognized that archaeology could be just as exciting as paleontology because there were people. Very important that unwritten history get preserved, retold, reestablished, especially it created ties to land. Any of you who have read the essay that I wrote will recognize that for me the importance is human relationships with land, with landscape, with place from which we all derive. So I did my first archaeological survey and keep telling my students way last century in 1968, and I've been doing archaeology in one form or another since then. Now, my talk today is going to be on indigenous archaeology. But basically, I'm just going to try to set the stage to help define what it is, what it has become, and the utility that it can be put. And then after rambling on here for 15, 20, 30 minutes, going to turn it over to Woody Aguilar, who's going to give a presentation about actually implementing Indigenous archaeology. So those of you who are familiar with archaeology, one of the first things we say is archaeology, it ain't dinosaurs. So archaeologists do not excavate dinosaurs. Again, that's the paleontologists. But we use many very similar techniques to paleontology. We look at materials in situ, in the location where they have come to reside, and then we try to derive information that we can from that. A good archaeologist is a good storyteller. Because what we are doing, we're taking bits and pieces of people's trash. Occasionally we find bits and pieces of people's treasures in terms of feathers, in terms of jewelry, ornamentation. And from those bits and pieces, we try to create stories of the past. We try to bring the people who lived those lives to light of day. Sometimes it's 10,000 years after the fact. Surprisingly, sometimes it's only 75 years after the fact. So archaeology is an ongoing relationship with human populations. I really like the idea of telling stories because quite often when people think about archaeology, they think about what happens in the old world, in Egypt, or in Greece, or Romans, that the materials that are very, very powerful. But what we like talking about are the very little tiny bits and things that we can really talk about relationships. I have a friend of mine who teaches at the University of New Mexico, has been really intrigued in the appearance of childhood and children in the archaeological record. It's little tiny pots that, when you look at it, you realize that really only a mother can love the decorations that are on it. It's like little fingerprints. It's like the hand on the proverbial refrigerator of the past. But when we start thinking about bringing children into the story, thinking about bringing women into the story, and when we start putting the arrowheads or the large mammoth into the background, is when I think we as archaeologists really do justice to the cultures that we are describing. Now, archaeology is a relatively young science. It's really only been around since about the 1870s and 80s. Thomas Jefferson did an archaeological excavation in the 1780s to try to figure out what the big mounds on this property were. But it really hasn't been in true academic existence until since about the first decade of the 19th century. But since then, it's grown exponentially. We've been able to document many of the earliest inhabitants of this land in southeastern United States. We've seen tremendous constructions, huge mounds that would cover 10 to 15 football fields at Cahokia or Moundville in the southeastern United States. And from those constructions, we've been able to understand how people interacted with each other, who may have traded something to someone else. Back around 600 years ago, in the Ohio River Valley, we find evidence of obsidian from Wyoming moving to the Ohio River Valley. We find copper from the Great Lakes region. We find lead from Oklahoma. We find alligator teeth. We find mica. We find these huge trade networks that extend over thousands and thousands of miles. Now, some of those materials, when they were traded, were finished products, carved shell. Other materials were just raw materials that were transformed into something else and then passed along to another group. So we can start answering questions about who were these people? How did they exist? We recognize as well that They probably didn't have it as bad as any of us going back and trying to survive at that time period probably would consider it. Thinking about it, that they didn't have to worry about getting up in the morning and commuting to work. Or maybe it was like, well, I gotta go to work today. Okay, I'm here, what am I gonna do? You know, it was all such a part of everyday life that I don't think they had any Thursday, Friday, Saturday concepts. It was all one day led to another, to another, to another. We do know that they had ceremonies. We do know that there were times when large groups would gather together, either to create new families, to reconnect with old families, to celebrate particular events. I worked on an archaeological site last year before last, where we find that 8,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, a group of people came together and killed 5 to 7 bison, or what we call buffalo now, but these bison had horns about tip to tip, this long, stood about this high at the shoulder, so they were bison with a capital B. But we can recognize that the way they hunted these animals, it's not something that one family could do on their own. So we're seeing people coming from the west, some other people coming from down in southern Texas, and another group coming from probably up in North Kansas. And they're meeting in this area, they're getting together, they're hunting, they're feasting, they're celebrating, and they're probably creating new families. The people are meeting mates, they're cementing relationships, and they're probably establishing some of the very, very first kernels of what have become maybe some of the 568 different federally recognized tribes in the United States. Archaeology, as a means of telling stories, has been hindered in the past, primarily by the people who were giving the precedence of being able to tell the stories. Up until the 50s and 60s, and to an extent into the early 70s, most of the people who told these stories were primarily male, primarily Anglo, primarily people who had no real connection to the extreme time depth of North America. In the late 60s, with the civil rights initiatives, members of the American Indian movement started drawing attention to the fact that most of the archaeologists who were telling these stories were retelling similar stories based on a background that had no connection to those stories. They were primarily coming out of a European concept of epistemology or truth, a Western concept of how information is gathered, how it's presented, how it is interpreted. So with the beginnings of the American Indian movement, academically people started questioning more and more who had the right to tell the stories and how those stories could be used by contemporary people. In the early 1970s, we started getting people who really drew attention. Late 1969, one of the individuals who had a great lasting influence on me was Vine Delory. In his book, Custer Died for Your Sins, he writes about, in chapter 4, about anthropologists. I can paraphrase some of his open quotes. Is, go into any crowd of people, pick out a tall, gaunt white man wearing a 10-gallon hat, a World War II Army flying jacket, and a large knapsack incorrectly strapped on his back. He will have a thin, sexy wife with swingy hair, an IQ of 151, in a vocabulary in which even the prepositions have a limit. So these people are anthropologists. Surprisingly, I read excerpts of Vinesbook in the August 1969 edition of Playboy, which goes to prove that I only read it for the articles. But it really made me stop and think that if I were getting into archaeology, and if I were getting into anthropology at a time when it was really being brought into question, should I be doing that? Or should I be doing like many of the other first-generation Native students were doing and become an attorney or a doctor or an engineer? I felt at that time that really if anyone was going to tell the story, again, those unwritten histories, that I felt honored to be in a situation where hopefully I could do that. And I met Vine some years later. I actually got him to autograph my original copy of my Playboy magazine and his book, Custer Died for Your Sins. So I have those at home. And got to talk with him about it. And Vine had really made a point that he felt that by the mid-70s and into the early 80s that American Indians had enough doctors, they had enough lawyers, and that it really was time to try to get people, American Indians, into the humanities to try to make more subtle changes within the academy and in areas where we hadn't gone before. So, in the 1980s and 90s, a couple of friends of mine wrote this article about trying to bring people into the field. They basically created the definition for what Indigenous archaeology is. It talks about Indigenous archaeology as being archaeology for, or with, by, and for Indigenous populations. It seems simple. It's a very simple definition, but what it does is it throws archaeology and the stories that it creates on its head. So in that regard, what we are doing now is looking at trying to create the stories that make a difference to contemporary populations. We try to bring individuals who have a different understanding of what it means to be indigenous onto the stage and be able to let them tell their stories as well. So it's no longer a lot of white Anglo-Saxon males telling the story, but it's really about giving insights to how we reinterpret the data. Now, data is something that doesn't speak on its own, requires someone to interpret it. It requires someone really to tease out much of what is available in the archaeological record. Each archaeological site is different. Each archaeological site tells us a story that builds upon many of the stories that we have gathered for the last 120 years. The stories I try to help the archaeological record tell nowadays are being used by the Ainu population of Japan to try to reconnect to their deep history. It's been put to some use by some of the indigenous people in northern Australia to help create connections between their children who no longer can actually spend 3 to 6 months in the bush and some of the old cave sites that they have all the cave drawings, all the stories, and all the ideas that their ancestors have taught. So it's a way of reconnecting people to country, country to ancestry, and ancestry back to 40,000 years to the people who first came on to each one of the respective continents. So with that, I really hope that I've set a very broad general stage for what Indigenous archaeology is, what it hopes to accomplish, and what it is continuing to grow into, and that is giving the opportunity to tell the stories to the peoples whose ancestors created those stories. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over to Woody, or Joseph, as he's known here, and let him give you his talk about his relationship and his culture's relationship with a tremendous event of 1680s. So thank you very much.